Hey everyone, welcome to Handing the Shame Back, a show dedicated to amazing survivors like you all across the world. We know that there are many of us out there, and this is just dedicated with big love and support to you wherever you are, so that you've got somewhere safe to land should you ever need it. My name's Gloria Masters, and I have a wonderful guest for you today. And before I bring her to you, I would just like to issue a trigger warning. And as you know, we do this because we're talking about child sexual abuse, and I don't want you feeling triggered and unsafe. If that happens, could you please stop watching? Go to the show notes below and you'll be guided to resource and support. I'd love to introduce you now, please, to the amazing Cheryl Hunter. She's all the way from Los Angeles. She is an author. She's a media expert in that she helps people bring their stories to the world in such a beautiful, polished way. She basically helps others share who they are and what they do. So, Cheryl, hello.
Hello, Gloria. I'm so thrilled to be with you today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a little process for you and I, trying to coordinate calendars and things. So I'm delighted that you're here. Thank you. So, Cheryl, we know there's a lot of this going on out there, and anything, maybe one thing you say could help a person in terms of a light bulb moment, or suddenly the clarity is there. So I guess when you're comfortable and ready, just as little or as much as you're ready to share would be great. Cheryl, tell us about you, the childhood sexual abuse, kind of where it began, who it was, all of that.
Thank you, Gloria. So I grew up in a very sheltered, remote part of the Colorado Rocky Mountains on a horse ranch. And I was very, very naive and very sheltered. And I, uh, I later, you talked about me, look, I'm just going to dive in here. You talk about me being a media expert and helping others share their message with the world. I started out sharing my message with the world. I didn't actually start out that way, but I was kidnapped as a teenager. And it was later law enforcement told me that they think they were traffickers who had something go wrong, and eventually they let me go. But years earlier, as a teenager, I was raped, and it was my first any kind of I'd never had any kind of romance or kissing or petting or anything. And it was the first experience in anything in that direction. And I see how it set the stage for the kidnapping to occur. Now, before, or lest anyone think I'm blaming or indicting myself, I'm not in any way. After the kidnapping, part of my recovery was I recognized that I wasn't the first person to go through trauma. And rather than just reading about it in a book and seeing what others had done, I wanted to forge a path and figure out a way through on my own. I felt that the process of discovering a path forward would be cathartic, and it was, in fact. One of the things I did was volunteering as a big sister. Another thing I did was volunteering at elder care facilities, and I did both for a decade and very full time. But as I saw and spoke with those who had gone through trauma, I ultimately, after just listening to them and hearing their stories, I codified what worked and didn't work in terms of helping people recover, and created my own educational framework, which was the message initially I'd taken out to the world. But what I learned in the process, Gloria, was that people who experience trauma, specifically sexual assault, rape, and those types of violations, particularly when we're young, we tend to have that recur in life. And for me, I'd originally felt, by the time it happened the second time, which was the kidnapping, I thought, something is so horribly wrong with me that this kind of violation would recur. I must have a sign on my head, or I must be so damaged in some way, or I must be being punished by God. All the litany of things that went through my mind. But when I learned that this was a phenomenon, is a phenomenon that survivors and victims suffer, it gave me an immense amount of freedom.
Yeah.
It wasn't some personal shortcoming. It wasn't something I had done wrong. This is something that occurs with frequency. So I say that because my journey to freedom, I've wanted it to become a journey that others can take, and my wish is that this conversation will provide some freedom where it can.
It's amazing. Can I just take you to something you've said, because I think
Anything.
it's really powerful. Just to clarify first up, if okay with you, Cheryl, how old were you when you were first raped as a teenager?
Well, I was 14.
Yeah, see, that's that critical time, isn't it? And I'm not, please, survivors watching, hello, beautiful ones, not saying that there's a good time to have any of that occur, but it's really tough. I want to, if it's okay, Cheryl, I'd like to look at that link, because there are stats actually that show us that if you were abused once, and I think it's for girls under 12, children under 12 who have been sexually abused, are more likely to be abused again in life, not once, but twice. Once before the age of 16, and then again after the age of 16. So I was just thinking about what you were saying in that link, and I'm thinking, gosh, that's, it's quite interesting. What do you make of that?
I've just, look, anecdotally, I've experienced it, but I've seen it. My work then for many years, far more than a decade, was helping survivors, mainly survivors of sexual assault, rape, and trafficking. And that was just what was expected. That it's happened more than once. I paused as you answered or asked me this question, because I thought of, the brilliance of handing the shame back, how it happens once and we become so shame bound, but then it happens a second time, and I think that ensures our silence. And it's this tricky, just again, it's a phenomenon that keeps us captive. And I've explored a lot about captivity, having been physically held captive, because the irony was, after I became free, I felt more captive than ever. And what I've learned is that the captivity of the mind is far more pervasive than the pernicious, intractable, than the captivity of literally being physically captive. And part of the captivity is that shame spiral that invariably occurs if we've been uh, abused in such a way. And it's a funny phenomenon. I don't know, funny is not the accurate word, but as you're speaking about my experience and me being 14, there's a secondary shame there. Like, how dare it's not literally, but this thought comes up, like, how dare I speak with you and people that were had this unthinkable abuse as toddlers and children, about being a 14-year-old at age double the age at which people are married off into this horrible sex slavery and things. But look, it is what it is. I'm not going to perpetuate the shame by adding a layer of my own, but it's an amazing thing, shame, how it keeps us silent and captive and self incriminating and all.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there's a couple of things, and thank you. You're just doing beautifully, beautifully well. Thanks, Cheryl. The first thing is that, when you consider it, the abuse occurs in silence.
Mm.
Secrecy is ensured because we were children, and anybody under the age of 16 is a child, just FYI. And that silence is ensured, and then shame is immediate, because we, paraphrasing, let it happen. No, we didn't. We had no power. So there's you as the 14-year-old, there's the perpetrator. There's the power differential is huge. As an adult, yes, we can look back, but the reality is we were 14 or younger. And the point is, shame will always take the gold, and that is what keeps us trapped, and that is what keeps us hidden, and that's what keeps us silent, and all of those things, as you know. So the other thing too is we call it comparative suffering, and you've already identified this. It's such a waste, Cheryl, because it may have been a one time, or it may have been 100 times. Guess what emerges in us as survivors is the exact same trauma responses. So I've got you there. Stop comparing. We all have trauma response.
It's such an interesting thing. As we're having this conversation, I'm recontextualizing something that occurred. We had a babysitter who I was 6 or 7, and she was a much older person, but still a girl. Yeah, I mean, meaning like not an adult.
You mean like an older teenager sort of thing?
Yes. Yes. And she did something I have literally never told anybody, literally. And never, not my parents, nothing. I was so ashamed of it. I felt like such a quote bad girl, at the age like 6, 7. Uh you don't there's the language is just so childish. She performed oral sex on me. And I remember being horrified.
Just breathe.
Literally never told anybody that.
Just breathe, honey.
And thinking that, God,
It's okay.
that I had done something, quote, nasty, But as we're going through the thoughts about linking prior sexual assault, I've looked at that. I mean, I'm just sure the context is for, it's a probably quite universal context, like I did something bad.
Yeah. And look, the thing is, though, just as you're speaking um, of course, it's going to emerge, and you're safe, and you're so, so brave, and you're giving permission for our beautiful survivors watching, who may also have not deliberately diminished or minimized, but made less of what did happen, and that actually was sexual abuse, as you now know. So yeah.
I've thought, well, I mean, I literally haven't thought about it. I would have, if I had thought, well, there was no penetration, but let's, at that age, yeah, no, just no.
No,
Huh.
that's sexual
Anyway,
that's sexual abuse.
yeah,
So
yeah.
Cheryl, really honor you for that, for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you for the space to observe, and frankly, the safe space you create to share. If there's something, one of the things I've learned, I told you I codified what worked with all these survivors in more than a decade, and created a framework to help people overcome the impact of yesterday's trauma. And one of the things I find is incredibly cathartic is being able to speak our truth. And I don't mean trauma sharing, which oftentimes people might misunderstand that as. I mean, inside of a safe space, and again, Gloria, thank you for creating that. Inside of a safe space, being able to claim and own and speak and be heard and known for that. Not that we necessarily want to be known as a victim or known as a survivor, but known, which is distinct.
That's because that's the core of you, and everything about you, special survivor, is, and to all you beautiful ones watching, is everything about you has led to this moment. You could not have experienced what you did and be able to do the work you now do had you not been able to unwrap and demystify. So thank you, because that's really powerful for us as survivors. And too often, when we contextualize sexual abuse, it's a very good point you raise. It's not actually penetration. Is, if you think of a continuum, that's only physical sexual abuse. There's also non-physical sexual abuse, showing children child sex abuse materials, showing children genitalia, masturbating in front. That's all considered child sexual abuse.
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
Forgive my
No, but you.
naivete on that. Yeah.
I'll send you the
God,
book. It's all in there. But
thank you.
look, it's huge, and just I'm so honored for trusting and to
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you.
Okay, so are you okay for us to move. We've probably got about
Anything. Yes.
8 minutes left in this part. So one of the things I guess I was interested in knowing, because this is something sometimes when as children we've experienced the abuse, and as teenagers as we've experienced the abuse, it becomes bigger and bigger in us until the narrative is there must be something about me, as you so aptly coined. I'm wondering, were you ever able to share any of that? I'm talking about the 14-year-old, with a parent or an adult that you trusted?
No, not at the time.
Not at the
I
time.
felt too ashamed. And I didn't share it. One of the things I did at cathartic, I found it cathartic to create something, like some artistic expression. I'm a writer and an author. I used to write TV, and I've written several books, but I wrote a book, a coming of age novel that had a lot of the elements that I'd experienced uh, as a teen, as a girl, and I shared it with my mom, and she read it. I had written it during a writer's strike, a previous writer's strike back in 2007, 2008. I had sold a TV show and suddenly had been writing every day and couldn't write anymore. And I was still suffering with the impact of that trauma from years gone by. And I decided to create something to sort of help dismantle it. And in the process of writing the story, I felt less captive and less constrained. And the process of sharing it with my mom was very therapeutic for both of us as well.
And did you find her instantly believing of you and supporting of? Wow.
I did. There were a couple of I had already shared with her the kidnapping at that point, and I did not immediately share it with her. It was more than a decade later that I had. Similarly, I felt so damn ashamed
Yeah,
and filthy and ruined and all those
yeah.
awful things, but I had waited so long to share that with her, and she said, upon reading the novel, she said, you know, there were a couple of times in your life when I knew something had happened, and many times would blessed to grow up with a very spiritual, wonderful, accepting, receptive mother. I still didn't want to tell her though. But she said I'd made entrees into getting you to share, and I knew that you would when you were ready. And she immediately, of course, believed it. She was always that way, but she'd also said, I knew something happened around that time. I didn't know if it was that your father and I were splitting, but I suspected it was something deeper.
Wow. So was the abuser, the rapist, the pedophile known to the family or known to her? Because that tends to be what happens.
Well, obviously the babysitter was. She lived down the street.
Yeah, no, I
Uh,
mean 14
but
when.
and then at age 14, I wanted to include the babysitter now that I've thought about that, because I remember whenever she would come over, she'd say, "Let's do something nasty." That was her quote. And I was like, good God, now that I'm thinking about it, that was how she'd say it. And I was always like, no, but she'd lock us in the bathroom together. So anyway, but I did want to say that, yes, she lived down the street and was a neighbor's
Yep.
daughter.
But the
But
14-year-old,
the person
yeah, the
at
people who raped you at 14.
14, He was a boy in town. My
Okay.
parents knew of him, but did not know him. They knew his father.
So, wow. You okay, lovely one?
I am. Thank you.
Okay. We are going to close out there for part 1. Please stay there, Cheryl, and we'll come back with part 2. Audience, lots of power in these interviews. Just, amazing Cheryl being able to share a really deep held part of her actually, and I know that she's going to feel so much better and a weight will be lifted. The power she shares in terms of a lot of things she said already, but things like the captivity of the mind, and isn't that true, and can't we relate, and just to be able to make sense of all of that is so important. So, as always, lovely ones, I see you, I stand beside you, and I believe you.